how in 1989, writers Lawrence Marks and Maurice Gran teamed up with another pair of childhood friends from North London, Pauline Quirke and Linda Robson, to create Birds of a Feather, a controversial no-holds-barred sitcom fueled by sexual frustration after two sisters were thrown together following their husband's conviction for bank robbery. Aided and abetted by Leslie Joseph and executive producer Alan McEwen, Birds dumped on the 9 o'clock watershed from a great height and shocked the early evening audience, who retaliated by jamming the BBC switchboard with complaints. Could the show really have been remotely shocking? And are we really talking about that Birds of a Feather?
Look. I ain't got a crotch. Who'd wear them? Oh, I would.
When was the last time you saw a pair of crotchless knickers at 8:30 on what should have been a nice lightweight comedy series?
Having women talking that openly and frankly had never been seen on English television previously.
You spend your life lying for your dentures to that husband of yours. Stick a pin in the phone book and it's odds on it'll land on someone you've had an affair with. You are not my mother. You have no right to talk to me like that. Everyone round here knows you're the most popular ride outside Alton Towers. We weren't trying to be risky, we were just trying to show you what it's like in real life, but showing you sort of the humorous side of it, I suppose.
We played it like a drama, and as such, as it developed, it sort of became almost a drama, and it was almost like a soap.
I don't care. I still don't want to know, all right?
No, it's not all right. I want to open
And I don't.
because you're the oldest, it's all right. Oh, as usual.
Have I called it a bad time? Oh, good. I love to see working-class women bicker. It's so Albert Square.
We wanted to really hit them hard.
Listen here, yo-yo knickers.
But really you're going to start hearing language and behaviour of girls that live in this kind of environment and come from these kind of places.
I needed very, very badly some hit programmes before 9 o'clock, and I think that was my driving priority, so I was prepared to take as liberal as possible a view of things. But I think we were pushing our luck.
The controller's liberal attitude to the watershed left the BBC hierarchy aghast, and Birds of a Feather nearly ended up as the dodo of British situation comedy.
There was quite a lot of rumbling in the BBC about it. The governors sort of raised up their heads and sort of sent messages down the M40 to television centres saying that this was inappropriate for 8:30. They never went quite as far as saying it was inappropriate for the BBC, but I think, there was a snobbery underneath it where people looked at it and thought, this is much more suitable to that commercial channel over there than this nice public broadcasting thing.
The Marks and Gran style was more cockles and mussels than coq au vin, and something of a new departure for the BBC. Birds of a Feather was the first time they'd called on Auntie, despite an impressive track record of successful series written for ITV and Channel 4 in the previous decade. Their biggest hit was Shine On Harvey Moon, a show which significantly brought them together with producer Alan McEwen, and with Linda Robson and Pauline Quirke, who would emerge as fully fledged Birds 7 years later. In 1977, Lawrence, then a journalist, and Maurice, a bored civil servant, got their first taste of success on the Frankie Howerd radio show, and then writing sketches for Marty Kane. The sketch show wasn't a taste they particularly enjoyed, and it convinced them that giving up the day jobs would be a bad idea. But they persevered and were once again set to cast off the shackles of a 9-to-5 existence when, in 1980, London Weekend Television commissioned Holding the Fort. Their first sitcom was a role reversal comedy starring Patricia Hodge, Peter Davidson and Matthew Kelly, and ran for 20 episodes. But the civil service and journalism seemed to beckon again after their second sitcom Roots suffered a painful extraction, though there was to be a silver lame lining.
It was such a fantastic hit that it got taken off after 2 weeks from its 8:30 Friday night slot.
By Michael Grade?
By Michael Grade, who was looked after scheduling for the weekend. Luckily, we were also developing at the same time a show called Shine On Harvey Moon. That sort of cast a sufficiently large shadow that people sort of forgot about Roots.
Shine On Harvey Moon was the story of an RAF corporal who had been presumed dead, a bit like the budding careers of Marks and Gran. He wasn't, and after the war returned to rebuild his life.
Me and Veronica's having the day off work day to go and watch the royal wedding.
Do you know they're cousins on both sides? Yeah. Well, they shouldn't do it. It's very dangerous. Very funny things can happen. I had a friend, she married her cousin, and their boy had ears out here.
Adam Faith was going to play Harvey Moon originally.
Yes, that was
And, you know, it was developed for Adam, which is why Linda Robson and Lee Whitlock were cast as the children, because they were blonde and could pass as Adam's children. And Adam
lost his nerve. He, just before Christmas, said, I can't do it.
Losing a blonde who'd lost his bottle was more than made up for by the casting of Kenneth Cranham as Harvey. And there was another piece of good luck in the shape of Pauline Quirk, who'd come along to a recording to support her pal Linda.
Kettle's on, Mr. Moon, because I've got a squash bowl.
Hey?
Well, hot water's the only thing for it, isn't it?
We've been playing ping pong.
She just made us laugh all the time. She was really very funny. She was a large girl, of course, as she probably still is. And she was just had great charisma.
So off-screen best friends Pauline and Linda became on-screen best friends Veronica and Maggie.
So why haven't you seen him no more then, this Tom?
Because I thought me and Lou were still going strong. There was a scene of me and Pauline sitting around a dining room table, just like as girls do, flicking through a magazine, and they were underrun a bit, so they just asked, would we improvise a little bit? So we did. It was just like talking about what we were looking at in the magazine. And I think that was where the sort of idea came from, that, you know, the chemistry between us two, even improvising. They decided then that they were going to try and write something for us.
We was always going out and having a lark before you met Lou.
The other knew what the other was going to say before they said it, and I don't mean because they'd learned the script. There was that kind of telepathy between them that long-term friends have.
That telepathy shouldn't have come as a surprise. Outside of Pinky and Perky, there are few television friendships that have endured as long as that of Linda Robson and Pauline Quirk. Friends since primary school, they embarked on an almost identical career path, which would lead to national fame in Birds of a Feather. They began acting at the Anna Scher Theatre Group, and one of their earliest appearances was in the 1970 Children's Film Foundation production Junket 89.
You've seen my new watch, haven't you?
No, we haven't. Only about 20 times today.
Daisy? Here, Boston. Come and show Daisy what we do the clever dicks, eh?
And their comic potential as a duo was first spotted on the Thames TV kids show You Must Be Joking in 1975.
What's all this mess, Steve?
It's blood, isn't it?
Blood?
Yeah, from the David Nixon show. Must have been throwing them women in half.
Not again.
Yeah, it'd be too bad if he admitted he couldn't do it after the first one. Said he had to keep on trying, over and over again.
Yeah, but it's those poor young actresses I feel sorry for. Real cut up by it, they were.
People do anything nowadays to get into show business.
The next year, when she was still only 16, Thames gave Pauline her own show, Pauline's Quirks. These girls were going places. And to prove there was life away from ITV, Pauline was cast as Nurse Vicky Smith in the BBC drama Angels. Prior to Harvey Moon, Linda played a teenage runaway in There's No Place, a performance which helped cement her reputation as one of the country's best young actors. By the mid-1980s, Harvey Moon was installed in the bosom of the TV schedules, and members of his family were flying the nest and spreading their wings. Alan McEwen produced Auf Wiedersehen Pet for Central TV, while Marks and Gran created a spin-off from Holding the Fort for Matthew Kelly's character Fitz. The show Relative Strangers did well for Channel 4. In 1985, Marks and Gran scored another huge hit for Central with Rollover Beethoven, starring former Young One Nigel Planer and Mrs. Alvin Stardust Lisa Goddard. The following year, Alan McEwen delivered Lovejoy, the detective-cum-antiques dealer, to the BBC. Lawrence and Morris did a Frankie and went to Hollywood. Within a year, they were back. Richer for the experience, Marks and Gran even had Terry Wogan roll out the beige carpet for them. And that night, they met Rick Mail, who asked them to create a series for him in which he could play to his strengths.
I have had just about enough of you. There's always one ugly, fat, acne-ridden swat with glasses and overactive sebaceous glands who's got to show off to make up for his or her, and in your case I'm deliberately hedging my bets, physical repugnance. What's your name?
Agnes Tebbit.
The The New Statesman put Marks and Gran at the top of the sitcom tree, and in true 80s style, they decided to cast off their downtrodden writer image and join the boss class, setting up Alamo Productions with Alan McEwen. Success was instant. To discover the origins of Birds, we need to go back to Christmas Day 1988 and to a London hotel where Maurice Gran was having dinner, as were two women who he speculated might be gangsters' moles.
Later on, I saw them with their husbands paying their bill, and so I immediately fantasised that these two guys had robbed a bank about 5 years before, and as I was queuing up to pay my bill, behind these two blokes, one of them said to the other one, "Got any plans for Boxing Day?" And the other one said, "No, I think I'll fly back to Marbella." So I thought, that's not a bad stab in the dark, is it? So about a week later, I told Lawrence this anecdote, and he said, "Linda and Pauline." And I said, "Yes, I think you're right."
They sat down and explained the story about these two sisters, one that lived in a really, poor estate, lived on the 6th floor, the lifts were never working, her husband treated her really badly, and then the other sister, who lived in a really lovely house in Essex, husband absolutely adored her, never had to work, husband just looked after her all the time. But as they were telling this story, Pauline went, "I know which one I am. And I know where I'm going to live."
I recall we had one line.
Wait for me, Tracy. Wait for me and all, Sharon.
What? You must be bloody joking.
And we thought that encapsulated the relationship of these two.
With Linda, Pauline, Alan, Maurice and Lawrence reunited for the first time since Harvey Moon, Birds was almost ready to take flight. All that was missing was Dorian, the Jewish princess next door. Leslie Joseph had survived appearing in 2 episodes of Roots in 1981.
Since Howard works for his father and it's officially a company car, the old man makes the rules. He won't have German, he won't have Italian. Since they televised a town like Alice, he won't have Japanese. He's not keen on French because they all collaborated, and East Europe is out because they're all anti-Semites.
And with hindsight, she seems the only possible choice.
They were looking for a character to balance out Pauline and Linda, who were East End, moved out to Chigwell, and who lives in Chigwell? Yes, quite a big Jewish population.
Hello, my name's Dorian Green. I live next door. Can you help me? I'm in the middle of a terrible crisis.
And they wanted this sort of slightly heightened glamour. It was when Essex people were suddenly hitting the news. A lot of jewellery about, and the only 2 things you need to make Dorian, her high heels and these long nails with diamonds on the little fingers.
It was a strange triumvirate, if you like. I mean, there were the 2 girls from the Anna Scher School, really streetwise kids from Islington.
I just don't want this stuff in my ass.
Oh, they're nothing. Everything else in the front room needs batteries.
And Leslie Joseph, who I suppose did belong to the legitimate theatre. And it just seemed that you got these 2 sets of diverse characters and put them together in a show, and it just hit.
The first thing it almost hit, though, was the buffers. In those far-off days, the 9 o'clock watershed was sacred.
It was so romantic watching your jeans wrapping themselves around my knickers.
And the language and sexual content of that first episode caused a storm of protest.
I think we were doing episode 4 when the first episode went out, and there was quite a big uproar after the first episode went out because Pauline said the B word. I don't know if I'm allowed to say the B word on television. Bastard.
If I'd known you couldn't have kids...
Oh, you bastard.
Oh!
And there were 100 and something complaints. I think it was Gareth Gwendolyn at the time came down and said that they might have to pull the plug on it.
I remember calling in the producer at the time, and we had a fairly frank exchange of words because it was too late to do anything about it. It had been commissioned as a pre-watershed. I think this was Low and Mo doing what they always do, having a little push at the envelope.
I don't know if I should be telling you this, but when the first one went out, we all went to the producer's house, Esther Charkham at the time, and had a couple of glasses of wine and watched the episode going out. So at the end of the episode, she rang the BBC to see if anyone had rung in, and they then told her that there'd been so many complaints. So we then all did different accents and rang up to say how wonderful we thought the 3 women were in this series.
The producer must have phoned up and said there's been over 100 complaints, and you have got to go on breakfast time, whatever it was called then. It was a very early proto-Frank Boff in a sweater and no handcuffs breakfast show to defend this programme. And this show is almost certainly going to be cancelled. Be there, don't wear a tie because your neck will need to be exposed for the axe.
Absolutely astounded that the BBC are putting on rubbish like this before the 9 o'clock watershed.
As I recall, the response was so big that extra staff had to be drafted in to answer the phones for the second episode. So that shows that it was, you know, of quite a high order.
Tracy's pregnant.
What? So Mother Teresa's wandered off the straight and narrow, has she?
It's Daryl's, you toe rag.
Yeah? What's he been sticking his envelopes down with?
Despite the controversy, Marks and Gran refused to compromise the content of the programme.
I don't give a toss either way. At least I don't have to worry about you. Your fallopian tubes are more congested than the Bakerloo line in the rush hour.
You're a real piece of scum, you are.
There was these 100+ complaints about the language and the sexual content and the criminal content, and yet the family would gather around the television together, kids and all, and say, can we watch that show with, you know, Tracy and Sharon in? And it was, I wish we knew how we did it.
In many ways, it was the Sharon and Tracy show. As refreshingly for British sitcom, the men were peripheral figures. After the jailing of Daryl Stubbs and Chris Theo
got a lot of this, you stupid old fart.
Another unusual thing about Birds was that whilst it wasn't purely a programme for women, it certainly was a programme about women, the absence of men in their lives and how they coped.
I don't think I'm going to be able to go about a man until Daryl gets that. I really used to enjoy sex. Lean up against that washing machine when it's on spin ain't no substitute.
With Sharon, you see, you knew that she'd had a sort of hard life and her husband was a bit of a waster, but she was a waster too. You know, when he stole money out of her purse, she said...
Do you know how many customers I had to short change to scrape that 30 quid together?
She was as bad as he was. They really deserved each other. But she was stronger than Tracy and more resourceful. Tracy had the looks. She'd married, you know, she'd got engaged at 17 or 18 to the boy who was going places. She didn't know he was going places with a stocking over his head and a sawn-off shotgun, but he was going places. And so Tracy had been protected from the realities of life, and Sharon had had her face rubbed into the realities of life.
Which was something of a contrast to neighbour Dorian Green, who was in a gilded cage of her own making.
What you're doing is searching for a fully satisfying relationship with a man. I mean, your husband loves you, but he can't keep you happy physically. Your lovers keep you happy physically, but they don't love you.
Oh, God, Sharon, I must be so transparent. Am I that easy to read?
No. But your diary is.
And for a nymphomaniac in need, not even the husbands of her best friends are off limits.
They run out of Kit Kats, so I got you a flake instead.
That's so thoughtful of you. Keep the change.
You don't have a tissue, do you? Funny enough, I was going to ask you the same question.
I think someone described her as enter next-door neighbour carrying the plot.
Cyberplot.
If you are so morally far above us, then I shall pack up my harmless love toys and vanish from your life as suddenly as I entered it.
She didn't steal the show, but she certainly made a pretty good attempt to hijack it.
It was nice meeting you, Sharon. You might live in a slum, but you do have a certain grace.
You needed this absolute snob that could then bond those two together so they could fight against each other, but if you had somebody coming in from the outside, they could bond and fight the common enemy, which they saw her as. But of course she wasn't really the enemy, she became their greatest friend in the way. And that again was something that became quite touching, would be the way that if Dorian didn't appear for a while, one of them would worry about her.
How can I compete with a 19-year-old? We're in here, Shell.
Blimey, it's Alice Cooper.
I think one of the reasons why the girls were so loved was because they weren't afraid to show the vulnerabilities below the surface.
No.
One of the scenes which I remember most is one that Pauline and I did where she came to stay at my house and she'd say,
"Don't you ever wish you had kids?"
But you see, there comes a point when you have to choose children or beige carpets. I opted for carpets. And again, what made this different to a lot of other sitcoms? Normally, that's a laugh, you get the laugh, you move on. What they did, they just looked into my eyes where you saw a hint of a tear and you realised that actually she'd love children, but she did love her carpets too much, but she knew that her life would be sad and empty because of it.
It seemed to me they had an incredible touch in producing hits. You know, if you said to someone like Lawrence and Morris and Allen, "Give me 26," they'd say, "Can we give you 52?" If you said, "Give me 26 to an in-house department," they'd say, "I think we can manage 7.
The BBC's appetite for Birds of a Feather was insatiable, but Marks and Gran wanted to create brand new series while still retaining control of Birds. So they had to recruit other writers. The girls weren't happy and wondered if their world would collapse around them.
After being hands-on for, I don't know if it was the second, third, I think probably about the third or fourth series, that they then were finding it hard because they had other commitments as well. So they then brought in a couple of writers and we were really nervous.
The girls seemed to think they'd lost their parents when we were not there.
Lo and Mo, having been the creators, wanted to keep control and had the right to have control, and it was probably becoming increasingly difficult for them to have that control in the sense that there was resistance, there were arguments.
I think the stars of the show felt that we had recruited them, we had gone to them and said we would like to write you a series, without saying, and if it's very successful, we'll not be there anymore, but these other writers will.
So when the new writers for Birds arrived, Marks and Gran went off to create new shows for Alamo. Their first project, Get Back, starred a young Kate Winslet and a man they'd previously upstaged with a chocolate flake, Ray Winston.
I mean, I love going with my brothers on a bus like a penniless pauper.
Penniless pauper is a tautology, actually.
A what?
A tautology. If you're penniless, you must be a pauper, and vice versa by definition.
Oh, right. It's blinding. So if he starts chucking it down while I'm waiting for the number 19, I'll just remember that penniless pauper is a tautology, and I'll have a little chuckle myself.
And in the same year, Adam Faith kept his nerve and his position as the nation's favourite wide boy by appearing in Marks and Gran's drama Love Hurts with Zoe Wanamaker. In 1993, Mr. and Mrs. Alan McEwen, aka Tracy Ullman, returned to the USA in triumph with their show Tracy Takes on New York. Back in the world of wartime Britain, Marks and Gran created a vehicle for Nicholas Lyndhurst. Goodnight Sweetheart ran for 57 episodes over a 6-year period, the length of the war itself. And after seeing Marks and Gran move on successfully from Birds, Linda Robson and Pauline Quirk decided they'd do that too. And in 1995, they tried their hand at a variety of possible new careers, including opera singing in Jobs for the Girls. Pauline, in particular, revelled in her newfound freedom and was nominated for a BAFTA after her performance as the monstrous Olive Martin in The Sculptress.
Do I scare you?
And as new opportunities came their way, Birds of a Feather came further down the pecking order.
I seem to remember, I mean, it probably must have been after series 7, probably. I thought it had ended, and I think we even had celebratory parties to sort of all say goodbye to each other.
Every year I take the girls out for a dinner and talk them into doing more shows, which wasn't always easy, actually.
He made it impossible for the girls not to carry on doing the show.
I think it did come back after about 18 months. I remember thinking, maybe cynically, the tax bills must have arrived.
Look, we can do this amicably. It doesn't have to get nasty.
So that when the 9th series of Birds was broadcast in November 1998, it was clear the show had run its course.
I think the last series was a little bit of a sort of contractual obligation.
By the time they got to the last show, they'd really said all they could say as Sharon and Tracy. And I would imagine that they were all sick and tired of looking at each other.
The last ever scene of Birds of a Feather saw the girls celebrating the birth of Tracy's baby in a field in Ireland. So presumably, the congratulations spilled over to that last after-show party, and they all had nice things to say to each other.
I think what was said was, would you like another smoked salmon bagel? And I really ought to be getting off now. My car's arrived. And so Birds of a Feather disintegrated in the car park of Teddington Studios, never for the people in it or who worked on it to come together very much again.
After Birds of a Feather, Leslie Joseph returned to the stage, although she was back on the small screen in 2001 in the ITV soap opera Night and Day.
Here. The last of your things. I suggest you recommend the next handler wears full mask and gloves. Ugh. Infected trash. All of it.
In the spring of 2004, she found herself talking dirty with Linda Robson again in a theatre tour of the Vagina Monologues. Before that opportunity opened up, Linda had guest starred in The Bill and had her own DIY series, Renovation Street, alongside Craig Phillips, the one who won Big Brother 1. Her former sidekick Pauline Quirk's career blossomed. Immediately after Birds, she starred in 2 series about the doer detective Maisie Rain. She also played the part of Faith Addis in Down to Earth, before returning to pre-Watershed sitcom with Office Gossip in 2001.
My husband's a very jealous man. When he found out I had a male assistant, he got some mad idea into his head we were having an affair. No, yes. I mean, obviously, nothing could be further from the truth. Well, obviously. You're so much older than he is. I'm 35. In dog years.
Lawrence Marks and Maurice Gran also kept up the momentum after Birds of a Feather. In 1999, they wrote Starting Out for the BBC, before being reunited with Rick Mayall for a new ITV comedy. Sadly, good comedy connections aren't always everything. Believe Nothing didn't convince the viewers and lasted only 6 episodes. But the duo bounced back in 2002, creating the house that Jack built for Adam Faith. Despite all they've done before and since, this gang is likely to be remembered for Birds of a Feather, but it's how Birds is remembered that's interesting. Time seems to have obscured how brave, brash and ballsy it really was.
Go on, get out. Sing your rock. Get out. What, mate, what's up? Well, shake a piss off and all.
Birds of a Feather was, one of the biggest long-running commercial hits the BBC had for a long time. And it was a very good show, and it's never been quite recognised, I think, as, either a groundbreaking show or one of the kind of big classic comedies in the way other comedies have. And that's probably because it was about these loudmouth girls from Chigwell.
You fat, common, cockney type!